In interstellar warfare, victory belongs to whoever brings the most guns. That's what the Krell Hegemony believed when they sent thousands of warships to conquer the Viridia Cluster, a frontier system anchored by a human world called New Hope, home to 3 million civilians. They expected panic. Instead, they found a single diplomat, a 300-year-old legal clause, and a trap built entirely out of silence. The Krell Hegemony's high command did not believe in asking for permission. Their expansion was a mathematical certainty. In the Grand War Room of the Dreadnought Star Eater, Admiral Vax looked at the holographic display of the Viridia Cluster. It was a golden vein of resources, currently inhabited by peaceful, unaligned frontier colonies. Among them was New Hope, a human terraforming world housing 3 million civilians, including hundreds of thousands of families. To Vax, these were not people, they were obstacles. He raised a clawed hand, signaling the jump. Thousands of Krell warships shimmered and tore through the veil of subspace, emerging simultaneously in the heart of the cluster. The shock was immediate. Planetary defense grids across the sector flickered and died as the Krell jammed all frequencies. It was a display of overwhelming force designed to break the will of the inhabitants before a single troop transport landed. Vax waited for the frantic cries of surrender. He expected chaos. Instead, he found a silence so absolute it felt heavy. The silence was broken by a single, low-priority signal. It didn't come from a warship or a fortress. It came from a small, unarmed human shuttle sitting directly in the Admiral's flight path. On the bridge of the Star Eater, the Krell officers laughed. The shuttle was tiny, a speck of white carbon fiber against the abyss. Admiral Vax ordered the signal to be put on the main screen, expecting a desperate plea for mercy. The screen flickered to life. There was no crying, no shouting. A human male sat in a simple, gray suit. His name was Elias Thorne, a senior diplomat for the United Earth Coalition. Behind him, through a window, the blue-green marble of New Hope was visible, the planet the Krell intended to strip mine. Elias didn't look like a soldier. He looked like an accountant. He was holding a physical tablet, his expression unreadable and perfectly still. He didn't greet the Admiral. He simply looked at the camera with eyes that held no fear, only a terrifyingly calm focus. Admiral Vax, Elias began, his voice flat and authoritative, carrying the weight of a documentary narrator. You have just entered a sector governed by the Foundational Transit Act of the First Interstellar Era. By crossing the Viridia marker, your entire fleet has just committed a technical violation of Article 14. Admiral Vax bared his teeth, a guttural growl vibrating in his chest. I do not care for your ancient papers, human. My fleet is large enough to burn your laws out of the sky. Move your shuttle, or be vaporized. Elias Thorne didn't blink. He didn't even look at the Admiral's display of teeth. He simply tapped a button on his tablet. I am not here to argue, Admiral. I am here to serve notice. As of 30 seconds ago, your fleet's insurance and navigation protocols have been flagged. By law, this sector is now a designated no-fly zone for hegemony vessels. If you move 1 meter further, you aren't starting a war. You are triggering a structural liquidation of your empire's assets. The laughter on the Krell bridge stopped instantly. The navigation officers stared at their consoles. Every single Krell ship had just received a red alert notification. Their engines were being remotely locked by their own central computers. Vax roared, striking the command table. How? We are the Krell. Our systems are impenetrable. Elias Thorne finally leaned back, his first sign of a shift in posture. Your systems are built on Earth-designed core logic from 3 centuries ago. We didn't build a backdoor, Admiral. We simply built the law into the foundation of the galaxy's digital infrastructure. You aren't just in a no-fly zone. You are in a legal vacuum. If you fire a weapon, your fleet's reactor shielding will deactivate to comply with Safety Protocol 9. Your ships will melt themselves. The Admiral looked out the viewport. Behind the small human shuttle, a massive shadow began to detach itself from the moon of New Hope. It wasn't a fleet. It was a single, miles-long human Restrainer ship. It didn't have visible cannons. It was a massive, silent monolith of black steel, pulsing with a low-frequency hum that made the Star Reader's deck plates vibrate. The imbalance was now visible. The Krell had the numbers, but the humans had the key to the lock. The civilians on New Hope were no longer just targets. They were protected by a silent, invisible cage of the Krell's own making. Admiral Vax's breath came in ragged, reptilian hisses. On the bridge of the Star Eater, the air felt thin. Every tactical display was hemorrhaging data, bleeding crimson across the obsidian consoles. Reroute the core logic. Bypass the Earth protocols, he barked, his voice echoing with a desperation that silenced his crew. But the navigation officers didn't move. Their clawed fingers hovered over dead controls. The human no-fly zone wasn't just a signal. It was a physical barrier in their own software. On the main screen, Elias Thorne remained a statue of gray composure. He looked at a clock off camera, then back at Vax. Admiral, every second you remain in the Viridia cluster, your Empire's credit rating is dropping by 4 points. At this rate, by the time you reach New Hope's atmosphere, the hegemony will be bankrupt. Your soldiers won't be paid. Your fuel suppliers will cut you off. You aren't just fighting a Restrainer ship. You are fighting the very math that keeps your civilization alive. Vax looked at the viewport. The massive black monolith of the human ship hadn't moved an inch, yet it felt like it was closing in, suffocating his entire fleet with its silent, pulsating hum. To prove his point, Elias gestured to the side. Look at your long-range scanners, Admiral. Vax turned to the secondary tactical map. At the edge of the sector, 3 Krell supply freighters, carrying the food and oxygen for his millions of soldiers, had just come to a full stop. They weren't being fired upon. They had simply deactivated. Their AI captains had calculated that entering a no-fly zone voided their warp drive insurance, and the ships had automatically shut down to protect their corporate assets. This is the emotional anchor of your strategy, Vax, Elias said, his voice finally carrying a hint of cold steel. Those freighters are carrying more than just supplies. They are carrying the survival of your men. On New Hope, we have enough grain to feed our families for a decade. Your soldiers, however, have exactly 72 hours of oxygen left if those freighters don't move. You are holding a gun to your own head, and I am the only one who can help you put it down. The visible shift was undeniable. The Krell officers were no longer looking at the Admiral for orders. They were looking at the freighters. Vax turned back to the screen, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and newfound respect. You humans, you play with numbers like we play with plasma. Elias didn't smile. That would be a sign of arrogance. Instead, he simply adjusted his cufflink. We don't play, Admiral. We build. We built the jump gates you use. We built the encryption your bankers use. We even built the life support sensors in your armor. We chose to be diplomats because we realized long ago that it is much harder to fix a broken economy than it is to fix a broken hull. Suddenly, the Restrainer ship pulsed. A massive wave of gravitational energy washed over the Krell fleet. It didn't damage the ships, but it recalibrated their sensors. Every Krell ship suddenly saw exactly what was waiting behind the moon of New Hope. It wasn't just one monolith. It was a network of 12 more, hidden in low sensor shadows, forming a perfect geometric cage around the cluster. The no-fly zone was now a physical reality. The Krell weren't just blocked. They were surrounded by a silent wall of human engineering that they hadn't even detected until Elias allowed them to. Elias Thorne stood up in his shuttle, the first time he had changed his vertical posture. The escalation ladder has reached its top, Admiral. You can attempt to fire, and your ships will become coffins of molten lead. You can stay here, and your men will suffocate as your empire's currency becomes worthless. Or, Elias paused, the silence stretching for 5 agonizing seconds. You can accept the Viridia resolution. You will turn your fleet around. You will sign the cluster over as a permanent neutral zone, enforced by the United Earth Coalition. In exchange, I will reactivate your freighters and restore your credit rating before your high command even realizes you failed. Vax looked at his officers. He saw the fear in their eyes, not fear of the humans, but fear of the silence. The silence of their own ships, their own weapons, and their own future. The Admiral's hand, which had been clenched into a fist for the entire encounter, slowly began to unfurl. The power shift was visible in his very shoulders as he slumped back into his command throne, defeated by a man in a gray suit and a tablet. The bridge of the Star Eater was no longer a command center. It was a pressurized tomb. Admiral Vax's scale-covered chest heaved as he stared at the 12 black monoliths on his sensors. "One ship," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You said there was one ship." On the screen, Elias Thorne adjusted his glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses to hide his eyes for a split second. "I said there was a Restrainer ship, Admiral. I didn't say it was alone. They are part of a static grid. They don't need to fire because they occupy the space-time coordinates your engines require to function. To move forward is to attempt to occupy the same physical space as 10 million tons of reinforced neutronium. You aren't being blocked by a fleet. You are being blocked by a wall." Vax looked at his tactical officer, who simply shook his head. The Krell warships were drifting, their thrusters firing in useless bursts as the human grid nullified their momentum. The strategic shift was now irreversible. The Krell weren't just losing a battle. They were losing the ability to even participate in one. Vax lunged toward the screen, his claws clicking against the console. "You think you've won? My high command has already authorized a subspace ripple. If I don't report a victory in 10 minutes, they will collapse this entire sector. New Hope, your families, your legal documents, everything will be crushed into a singularity." This was the moment of peak tension. The human stake was no longer a background thought. It was the primary target. Elias Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked down at his tablet and scrolled. "The ripple generator on Krell Prime? The one powered by the Ethel turbines?" Vax froze. "How do you?" Elias interrupted, his voice a documentary-style monotone. "We didn't just build your jump gates, Admiral. We built the safety valves for those turbines. If a ripple is attempted while a no-fly zone is active in a connected sector, the feedback loop doesn't travel to us. It travels back to the source. If your high command pushes that button, they won't destroy New Hope. They will delete their own capital city from the map." The realization hit the bridge like a physical shock. The Krell officers began to argue amongst themselves, their voices a cacophony of hissed threats and panicked questions. The hierarchy was shattering. Admiral Vax fell back, his eyes darting between the screen and his failing sensors. You've turned our entire civilization into a trap," he gasped. Elias Thorne finally looked up from his tablet, his gaze locking onto Vax's with a weight that felt heavier than the Restrainer ships. "No, Admiral. We turned your civilization into a partner. You just refused to read the contract. You saw a cluster of resources. We saw a community of 3 million souls. You saw a frontier. We saw a home. We didn't want this confrontation. But when you threaten a human home, you don't just face our soldiers. You face our architects, our lawyers, and our engineers. You face every hand that ever built a tool in this galaxy." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a no-fly zone. It was the silence of a predator realizing it was actually the prey. Suddenly, a new signal flared on the Krell bridge. It was a high-priority encrypted burst from Krell Prime. The High Command wasn't ordering an attack. They were ordering a full, immediate tactical withdrawal. The news of the Ethel turbine feedback loop had reached the Emperor. The strategic shift was complete. The Krell fleet began to turn, their massive triangular hulls groaning as the human Restrainer ships shifted their energy webs to allow a narrow, humiliating exit corridor. Elias Thorne watched them on his monitors. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call for a toast. He simply picked up a glass of water and took a small sip. On New Hope, the lights of the cities remained on. The families remained safe. The terraforming machines continued their slow, rhythmic work. The no-fly zone hadn't just saved a planet. It had redefined the rules of the galaxy. Humanity wasn't the strongest, but they were the ones who held the keys to the house. Admiral Vax stood paralyzed as his bridge crew executed the withdrawal. The Star Eater groaned, its massive hull vibrating as it entered the narrow Mercy corridor provided by the human static grid. On the main view screen, the image of Elias Thorne remained, but the framing had changed. He was no longer just a man in a shuttle. His feed was now being broadcast across every Krell ship, every civilian receiver in the cluster, and even the High Court on Krell Prime. The no-fly zone was now a legal reality, visible on every tactical map in the galaxy. "Admiral," Elias said, his voice echoing with a finality that made the Krell officers stop in their tracks. "You are not just leaving a sector. You are signing a precedent. From this moment on, the Viridia Cluster is recognized as a sovereign human protectorate under the Infrastructure Sovereignty Act." Vax looked at his navigation console. The Krell Imperial symbols were being overwritten by the simple, blue and white seal of the United Earth Coalition. The authority hadn't just shifted, it had been surgically removed. To make the transfer visible to the entire galaxy, Elias Thorne issued a final command. "Static grid, initiate command handoff." Outside the viewports, the 12 black monoliths began to pulse in unison. The violet energy webs that had trapped the Krell fleet suddenly expanded, turning into a massive, shimmering shield that enclosed the entire Viridia cluster. This wasn't a cage anymore, it was a fortress. At that exact moment, the Krell High Command on their capital planet sent a public, unencrypted signal. They were officially deactivating the Star Eater's combat authorization. Admiral Vax watched as his own weapons targeting systems went dark, replaced by a property of UEC notification. He was no longer an admiral of a conqueror's fleet. He was a captain of a decommissioned vessel being escorted out of a neighbor's yard. The power shift was earned, demonstrated, and now permanent. The Star Eater cleared the final marker of the Viridia cluster. The violet shield behind them solidified into a faint, translucent veil, a constant reminder of the no-fly zone. Admiral Vax looked one last time at the screen. Elias Thorne was closing his tablet. "Safe travels, Admiral," Elias said simply. "Our engineers will be at the jump gates to ensure your reactors remain stable during the transit. Consider it a gesture of partnership." The screen went black. The silence on the Krell bridge was no longer heavy with fear, it was empty. They had come to burn a world, and had been defeated by a man who never raised his voice. On New Hope, the children in the frontier colonies looked up at the sky, seeing the faint violet shimmer of the shield. They didn't know about Article 14 or Ethel turbines. They only knew that the giants in the sky had gone away, and the architects of their home had kept the lights on. Humanity had won not by destroying an empire, but by making it impossible for that empire to exist within their borders.